Welcome all to the First Unitarian Forum. We've been doing these forums for over 50 years and have a good program here today. I think it's the second of the series that we are doing on our county parks. We had an excellent program 3 weeks ago where we had Guy Smith, the executive director of the parks, and Sheldon Wasserman from the county board here to talk about the challenges. Today, we're going to take a look at another perspective from the Wisconsin Policy Forum from Rob Henken, who's is the staff head anyway. I'm not sure exactly of his title. And the overall title of our series is called Sinking Treasure, which is the name of the report that the Wisconsin Policy Forum has done on our county parks. So we're going to hear about some of the alternatives for governance and funding here today. And with that, let me turn it over to Rob Henken, our speaker for the day.
Thank you, Bruce, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you on this gorgeous Sunday morning. When you get a day like this and a weekend like this in late October, it's just wonderful. So, which is actually a good segue into the topic, because what a great day to be out there enjoying the county parks. We clearly, despite all you have heard and will continue to hear about the real challenges facing the Milwaukee County parks, we are so blessed in this community because this park system is still superb. If you look at Milwaukee compared to other similar sized metro areas, we are really blessed to have such wonderful parks and recreation resources. Of course, the topic at hand this morning is how do we keep it that way? And how really do we try to interrupt and reverse some deterioration that has taken place over many, many years, due largely to financial challenges. So go to the first slide. I want to give you a background. So it was about a year ago, it was October of last year, that the Wisconsin Policy Forum released this report, Sinking Treasure. And the background is the financial challenges facing the parks. This looks to me like a pretty well-informed group, and you've probably been aware for many, many years that not only is county government struggling with some very severe financial challenges, but also the county parks, because they are a discretionary function of county government, have really had to bear the brunt, because it's with these discretionary functions, the county is mandated to do so many things by state government, from health and human services to corrections, to the various sheriff's functions, et cetera, that it is the discretionary functions, and the two biggest of those are the parks and the transit system, that tend to have had the most difficulty. So these financial challenges, which I will summarize for you briefly in just a moment, have been talked about for years. We have talked about them for years. The forum, in our former name, the Public Policy Forum, and our former name before that, the Municipal Bureau of Governmental Research. Anyone here remember Norman Gill? Norman was the head of our organization under a different name from the mid-1940s through the mid-1980s. So we've been looking at this for a while. Despite the fact that the forum has sounded alarm bells, that county auditors, that special blue ribbon commissions have sounded alarm bells, unfortunately no action has been taken, and the problem has gotten worse, as I'll show you in just a second. You can advance. Let's just go to another bullet. So we were approached by the Milwaukee County Parks. It's one of the things that our organization does. Oftentimes governments approach us because they are either looking for our expertise, they're looking for our independence, or in this case, as is oftentimes the case, they're looking for both. Could the Parks Department itself have done an analysis of its own fiscal challenges? Of course they could have, but sometimes coming from an independent, objective policy organization is helpful. So we were commissioned by the Parks Department to conduct a research and facilitation project. But this one was a little different. Whereas we have done big projects over the past decade, again, honing in on why are there these financial challenges, just how bad are they? This one was geared more towards solution. And frankly, it's one of the reasons is because I said to the Parks Department, look, I'm sick and tired of just talking about the problem. Let's finally get into what realistically can be done. And I chose the word realistic very carefully because for the longest time we have been talking about solutions, but there are solutions that would require state government to act. One of the key questions that really has not been explored because so many are so frustrated that state government has not acted is what, if anything, can we do on the local level without help from the state to try to set things back in the right direction? Next bullet. So the report that I'm about to describe, it reassesses those financial challenges, but it also explores alternative funding and governance models, which we did by looking at a handful of peer park systems, both in Wisconsin and nationally. Slide. So let's start with just an overview of the financial picture. You can go to the next slide. This one, so I'm going to summarize a financial picture that, believe me, we covered in about 15 or 20 pages in the report. We probably could have spent 40 or 50 pages on it. But I'm just going to cover it in 4 slides, and it really paints the picture of what is going on here. So what is this slide telling you? It's showing you over a 30-year period, 1989 to 2019, the Milwaukee County Parks Department budget. So, those are the blue bar. I'm sorry, that's the blue line. The bars are, nope, got it wrong again. The lighter blue line is full-time equivalent positions in the Parks Department. The bars are budgeted operating expenditures in 2019 dollars. So in 2019, the Parks Department had a budget of about $40 million. When we compare their 2019 budget of about $40 million to their 1989 budget without adjusting for inflation, this slide adjusts for inflation. Bear with me for a second. If we did not adjust for inflation, we would find that the Parks Department budget was virtually identical in 1989. It was about $39.6 million in that year, about $39.8 million in 2019. So imagine if your own personal incomes had not increased at all over that 30-year period, where you would be because of the impacts of inflation, because we do have aging infrastructure in the parks that do need a great deal of care. That's a pretty mind-boggling proposition. And then when we do adjust for inflation, you can see that they should be at close to $80 million if we had just adjusted that $39.6 million based on the consumer price index over those 30 years. Their operating budget would have been about double what it really was in 2019. But the picture is also unfortunately illustrated by that blue line. Back in 1989, there were approximately 1,000 full-time equivalent employees working for the Milwaukee County Parks Department, taking care of those dozens upon dozens of parks and parkways and roadways and tennis courts and basketball courts and baseball diamonds and softball diamonds, etc. Fast forward that to 2019, just over 400 full-time equivalents. So you can see that this is not a real happy story from the financial front over this 30-year period. Can we go to the next slide?
Now we're having some problems here. Give us get back to screen sharing. Okay. So, yeah.
I can talk about the Packers while we're waiting. They better win today against a pretty mediocre team.
Okay, there we go.
All right, we're back. Unless you'd like me to continue to talk about the Packers.
Thank you, Jim.
I'm actually a native New Englander, so I'll talk about the Patriots. You definitely don't want to talk about the So, can you just go back one slide for 1 second? Okay, we finished that. Okay, you can go forward. So that's the 30-year picture. Let me paint those some other parts of the picture. You can go to the next slide now. Some other parts of the picture. So that story has been told repeatedly by us and by others, as I said. This is a story that has not been told as repeatedly. And this is a very important part of the story that has both good news and bad news elements. So what am I showing you here? I am showing you the composition of the revenues that support the Parks Department. And all we've done here very simply is the lighter blue is the county property tax levy, which until recently was the primary means of financial support for the Milwaukee County Parks. And the darker blue is all other revenues. Now, what are those all other revenues? They are almost exclusively earned revenues. What does earned revenues means? It means those are revenues that the Parks Department is able to recover to help pay for its services. Golf course fees, admissions into the domes or Burner Botanical Garden, the fees that leagues pay for to use county ball diamonds and courts, etc. Docking fees from McKinley Marina.
Does it include grants from other levels of government?
It does, but those are unfortunately a very tiny part of the picture. And for the most part, where you would see those four Bruces in the capital budget, this is just operating. But that's a part of the story too. There aren't a lot of grants from other governments supporting the Milwaukee County Parks. It's mostly property tax levy and a variety of earned revenues. Now, I can paint this for you as both a good news slide and a bad news slide. So the good news is that over the years, as the county property tax levy supporting the parks has essentially also stayed the same, just like the overall budget. The county, as I'm sure all of you are aware, has some really significant financial challenges. And so as the Parks Department has been unable to count on increasing levy from the county to support its operations, to their credit, Parks leaders have come up with some creative ways to try to make up for some of that loss of county property tax levy. So you may be familiar with the beer gardens, the traveling beer gardens. That's an example. Other types of new, and again, and this has not been without controversy. There are some who have fought tooth and nail against the notion of having any type of private entities making money through, for instance, restaurant facilities in the park. So I'm sure all familiar with Lake Park Bistro, owned by the Bartolotta family. And I'm not here to tell you whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. What I am here to tell you is there is some revenue coming into the county, rental fees from Bartolotta for the privilege of being able to operate that restaurant in the parks. What we have seen is that as the levy has essentially shrunk in real terms, is earned revenue has become increasingly a greater and greater share of the budget. So on the one hand, I can say to you that without that happening, the condition of the parks, based on the number of employees that the Parks Department would be able to afford, would be in much worse condition. But as I'm sure you are all thinking to yourselves, that now brings on another host of concerns. To the extent that we have to rely upon fees and charges to support this wonderful park system, what are we doing in terms of the access of low-income citizens to our parks, and for people to be able to enjoy them the way in an ideal world we would want them to, with unfettered public access. So we have this yin and this yang here going on, and that's a part of the story that hasn't received as much attention. Next slide. This just shows you, so I'm not showing you the dollars, but once upon a time in 1989, close to a quarter of the county's overall property tax levy supported the parks. And over time, as you can see, by 2019, only 5% of that county levy. The county levy is now over $300 million. So there's still a sizable amount of property tax levy, roughly $15 million or so, supporting the parks. The problem is that as the county has experienced fiscal problems over the decades, their ability to see their commitment to the parks grow, at least with inflation, has disappeared entirely. Again, requiring the use of new revenues, but overall the new revenues have not taken the place, and that's why you've seen the overall number essentially stay the same, but not grow in inflationary terms. Is this because county policymakers over time have decided the parks aren't important or aren't as important as other county functions? No, it's purely a mechanism, a byproduct of the fact that those mandated services that county government by state law needs to provide at appropriate levels have to take priority over the parks given their discretionary nature. Next slide. Finally, last financial slide, we also did a look at the parks budget that we think was rather unique. We wanted to get at this distinction that I just raised to you because it was so significant in our minds between the revenue generating amenities in the parks. So if you want to go and hike along the walking path at Fletch Park this afternoon, you obviously don't have to pay a nickel to do that. Conversely, if you want to go to the domes or Verna Botanical, or you want to play around the golf, if they're even allowing you to play around golf in October, you're going to have to pay to do that. And so we wanted to see, we found this finding on the revenue side. We wanted to look on the expenditure side, what types of dollars, because if you're going to earn money from these revenue generating amenities, don't you have a greater obligation to make sure that with your limited maintenance dollars, that those amenities are taking priority over those walking paths, those playground facilities, those tennis courts that are not generating revenues in the parks. And so what we found, and also another important question is, well, boy, if we're charging, if we are all acknowledging that certain amenities that Parks Department provides ought to be generating revenue, should we also be suggesting that revenue pay exclusively for the upkeep of those amenities so that the property tax dollars can be used for the types of amenities that don't have a charge associated with them? So we found that when we group them into these categories, only golf and boating are actually, in this case, covering their costs. And that's even a little misleading. Several golf courses are not, some golf courses are, you're lump them all together, they are. Boating, McKinley Marina happens to be one of the most profitable cost centers for the Parks Department, which is, fortunately, depending on how you look at it, unless you're maybe a boat owner, it is subsidizing some of the other public activities. But even some of these revenue generating centers, the horticultural centers, which is primarily the domes and Verna Botanical, aquatics, which are the swimming pools and the water parks, the sports complexes, the community centers, those are requiring some property tax levy support. So when you look at everything else in all of those parks, only $7.2 million is being spent for parks upkeep. And I don't have for you what the magic number is, what should that figure be, but I would feel confident, and I don't know if Guy addressed this with you a few weeks ago, that he would say that at least ought to be done for us to really take care of these parks the way we would like to be taken care of. So that gives you some context. Let's go now to the next set of slides. My takeaways. I just keep on going. Let's get all the bullets on the screen here.
Go back.
No, go forward. Hit it again. You'll get another bullet. One more time and one more time. All right. So again, in the report, which is available on our website, by the way, if anybody wants to read it, you'll see a more detailed breakdown. But again, I've told you what the main takeaways are here. The overall decline is just part of the story. How the revenue pie has changed is another very important part of the story that has implications for services, access, and sustainability. There's a new paradigm here. We have major amenities that make money. We have major amenities that require property tax support. And that's not saying they shouldn't require property tax support. It's just saying they do. And we have the traditional parks and recreational assets that tend to get lost in the shuffle. Again, I mentioned that parks upkeep is this major expense. You can't charge somebody. You don't want to charge somebody, I wouldn't think, to just go and take their dog and walk through Doctor's Park. But so how are you going to generate the resources if you're more and more dependent on these earned revenues to do that general parks upkeep? And finally, how do the principles of earned revenue maximization, which as business people, we would want to see embraced by the parks, but how does that principle gel and coexist with the very important principle of robust public access that has been around for decades upon decades for the Milwaukee County parks? When we look at this through a racial equity lens, that's a big question mark given, of course, the poverty in our community. And what we tend to only talk about is, well, what would it take to change that? and just maintain what we have. But what about if we also wanted to revision our park system and make it react to the fact that society is changing and different types of recreation are now valued more by citizens than maybe our parks amenities can provide because they're still rooted in the 70s and 80s. So lots of questions. We can go to the next slide. So how did we try to answer some questions? We thought maybe there's some good insights that we could develop by looking at other urban park systems in similar sized communities throughout the United States. And how are they grappling with these problems? There, very few governments out there are flush with cash. And so what maybe are some ideas that we could glean from some other places? So we did a big scan, originally looked at 15 or 20, narrowed it down to a half dozen, which I'm just going to briefly tell you about. Next slide. So not surprisingly, at the forum, when we do peer comparisons, it seems like we always tend to look at the Twin Cities, and more often than not, we say, gee, why couldn't we be more like the Twin Cities? Their operating budget for their city parks, $106 million compared to that $40 million or so that I told you about for Milwaukee County parks. But that's not what I'm here to talk about, how much money they're spending. It's what are some sort of distinct things they're doing on the governance and operational side that might be valuable for us. Well, first of all, we've had a lot of conversation about this in the community. They operate their city parks as a separate entity. They're a separate, separately governed by the Minneapolis Parks and Recreation Board. It's 9 elected members. So while the city parks have a relationship with city government and the mayor sets their budget, they are essentially administered by an elected board of commissioners. They have their own tax levy authority. So in the city of Minneapolis, the parks are not competing with human services, public health, transportation, etc. They have their own levy authority. We've talked about this here a lot. I'm sure several of you in the room have heard the conversation. Should the parks be taken out of county government? Should we have a separate parks district, maybe a separate parks and cultural district that would also include the zoo and the museum, public museum, and other cultural amenities? And should those potentially have their own specific source of taxation? And we don't take sides. One of the, whether rightly or wrongly, one of the big arguments there has been, but if you peel out, because we've talked about this for transit as well, if you peel off these different types of services and you give them their own taxation authority with their own boards, isn't the level of taxation in our community going to just grow too high? Well, Minneapolis had that concern, and so they have a pretty neat system where they have a separate board of estimate and taxation. So while the parks budget is proposed by the board of commissioners, the mayor then takes that budget, he considers it alongside the city budget, and he makes a recommendation. But end of the day, this board of estimate and taxation is there to ensure that overall, there's a couple of other independent bodies that are associated with city government in Minneapolis. Overall, the level of taxation in those bodies doesn't exceed a certain level that the board of estimate and taxation has deemed appropriate for that year. So if that's our concern, maybe we could look at something like this. Another interesting thing about Minneapolis, robust city park system, larger metropolitan park system administered by a metropolitan council, which is mainly big amenities. So not neighborhood parks or playgrounds, but regional amenities. And we think that's an interesting concept. What if you took the regional amenities, the domes in Burner Botanical, which I keep on talking about, McKinley Marina, they're all used for people across the region, including people who don't live in Milwaukee County. What if those were taken out and looked at regionally, and we let Milwaukee County really prioritize the more neighborhood-based parks that are nestled in neighborhoods throughout the county? Finally, and this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but I do feel I need to talk about it. They have an approach that we call the enterprise funding model. So like Milwaukee County and like many park systems across the country, you have this group of amenities. So even though I just told you there are regional amenities within the city of Minneapolis parks, there are also revenue generating amenities. They lump those together in one part of the budget and everything else in another. And they say that when it comes to their golf courses and swimming pools and other things that are making revenue, collectively, those are not going to be supported by the property tax. Collectively, those have to pay for themselves. Now, so again, it doesn't mean that each golf course necessarily is paying for itself, and that's how maybe you can have golf courses in low-income areas where you have to keep your fees lower or whatever. But overall, they say, look, if we're going to have revenue-generating amenities, we're not going to devote our property tax levy resources to those. We're going to preserve them for everything else, and so that's the way they did it. Lots of food for thought there potentially for us. Next slide. Make sure I don't go too long. Cleveland. What we found as standout elements for Cleveland is they have a mix of dedicated state and voter approved property tax levy. So here too, this notion of a dedicated tax, just as with the city of Minneapolis, where there is a specific tax that supports the parks. In this case, that was authorized by the state. So right now, if Milwaukee County wanted to have a dedicated sales tax or property tax for its parks, it would need to get state permission. In the case of Ohio and Cleveland, that permission was given. All local governments can levy up to a half cent to support their parks. And if they want to go higher than that, then they have to go to referendum. And they capped it at 3%. So right now in the city of Cleveland, it's 2.7%. The voters approved that 9 years ago. It's going to go back to the polls next year in 2023. And so again, if your concern is about too much taxation, why not have some baseline level of state authorization, but then ask the citizens of the community if they are willing to go higher to support their parks. So that's an element of Cleveland. Another important element is their use of nonprofits to do programs within the parks. Here we don't do a lot of that. But in Cleveland, you don't have parks department staff running programs in their parks. You have nonprofits, and arguably they have more capacity, but also they are paying to help maintain the ball fields and other amenities within the parks that they are using for their recreational activities. And so they have various fundraising prowess that a city or a county government may not have. So again, they're nonprofits, so it's not like we're seeing huge amounts of resources pouring into the Cleveland parks because they're doing it this way, but you have more of a sharing of the responsibility, but also greater usage of those amenities, arguably because you're using the nonprofits. They also happen to make much bigger use of volunteers within their parks that are managed by the Parks Department. Next one. Closer to home, Dane County. So you'd say to yourself, well, why are you looking at Dane County? They have the same restrictions that Milwaukee County parks would have. They have this, still would have to go to the state for a dedicated funding source, still don't have authority to be a separate independent district. And so sure enough, Dane County's parks in many respects operationally look like Milwaukee County's parks. But there's an interesting twist here. They're part of a larger land and water resources department. And the county parks there, because they're housed in that larger department, the environmental elements, the upkeep for environmental purposes, the flood control, and other things, other roles that our parks play that don't get a lot of attention, are handled by other elements and not necessarily by the people who are dealing with having parks amenities for people to use recreationally. So that's one difference. They have an advisory park commission. We once upon a time had that in Milwaukee County. It played a very instrumental role. But when we went to an executive form of government back in the 60s, we started to shy away from that. In the 1980s, the Independent Park Advisory Commission was just abolished because it really wasn't having much of a role. Well, in Dane County, it does. While it's advisory in nature, if there are fee increases proposed for Dane County parks, a citizen-led board weighs in on that question. And we think that could be important here because we have had a lot of fighting over the notion of fees in our parks. I don't know if any of you remember a few years ago when Chris Abele was county executive, there was a proposal to put parking meters along Lincoln Memorial Drive and have people have to pay to park to use the parks facilities along Lincoln Memorial Drive, and also potentially have paid parking at some of the other major parks. And I don't think anybody thought that was a good idea that anybody wanted to do. I know Chris Abele didn't, in his, believe me, he didn't want to have to propose something like that. But again, to the extent it was just shot down immediately, and I'm not arguing for it, but given where we are, if the choice is between letting everything deteriorate or maybe try to implement some new fees, certainly fees could and should be on the table. They often don't even get on the table here because they get very political. And that idea, as an example, also just became a mandate. Well, if you like Chris Abley, maybe you'd be sympathetic toward it, but if you didn't like Chris Abley, there's no way you're going to support it. And so by having an independent advisory committee, you can maybe take some of the politics out of some of the fees in terms of setting how high they are and whether you're going to have them. Let me see, anything else from Dean? I think I'll stop there just for the sake of time. Next one was, next slide, Seattle. So just a couple standout elements for Seattle. They have a separate park district, but it's really interesting. Their park district essentially exists in name only. And so the sole function of the park district is to collect the dedicated property tax. So you say to yourself, well, Rob, what's so great about that idea? Well, it's really some of the politics. So parks supporters and advocates over time have been concerned that if we did ever get to the point where the legislature would let us have a dedicated tax for the parks, that somehow that parks revenue would still get intermingled with everything else in county government, and it would never support the parks the way it was intended. This approach means that yes, those revenues coming in from the dedicated property tax are being spent solely on the parks. So it solves that problem. Where it solves a problem that county policymakers have been concerned about is that they have not wanted to give up jurisdiction over the parks for a variety of reasons. In this case, the Board of Commissioners of the separate parks district is the city council. And the city of Seattle still owns the land and the infrastructure, oversees the operations. So it could also be seen maybe as a compromise for those who, for whatever reason, don't think the parks should be removed from county government, but to make sure that any dedicated parks property tax just gets spent on parks. So that was a standout about Seattle. We can go to the next one. Sonoma County, California. We picked this one out because they use a sales tax, a voter-approved sales tax, to supplement the property tax that is provided to their parks. And we've talked about this notion here for years. There are certain pros and cons related to a sales tax. I'd be happy to talk for hours about that issue, but I'm not going to do that for you this morning. This could be done as a property tax as well. But again, the fact is, the citizens have to approve it. There's a base budget. If they want to spend more, they have the ability. In this case, it's an 1/8 of a cent sales tax. And so the other thing they do is that sales tax, county voters are approving it. It's shared not only with the county park system, but also with that county's 9 municipalities. Municipal governments here in Milwaukee County have playground and little neighborhood park needs. So might this also be a way to get the municipalities more enthusiastic about a dedicated parks funding source if it was shared between the county parks and municipal parks? Next one. And finally, we looked at the city of Madison. Robust city park system, as well as the Dane County park system. Here too, they have a very important board of park commissioners that set some of their fees and provides oversight. But the main reason we drew this one out is the unique relationship they have with the Madison Metropolitan School District. The school district uses the parks to a really extensive manner in terms of providing their recreation to their community. So recreation here is done at the school district level in the state of Wisconsin. We have Milwaukee Rec, as I'm sure you are all aware. But Milwaukee Rec is not really using the county parks very much. And there isn't that really formal relationship that says we are going to coordinate together and potentially also have the school district support maintaining some of the facilities they use. And now you're all thinking to yourselves, yeah, but MPS doesn't have any money. How's that going to solve the problem? Nobody knows this, but MPS does have a special fund for recreation that is not subject to state revenue limits. So if we wanted to pursue this idea, it is not as sort of silly as it may sound that Milwaukee Public Schools couldn't play a role through their recreational department, through Milwaukee Rec, in terms of supporting the parks. So just to conclude, I just want to wrap up by very briefly, next slide, looking at the options that we threw out there. So you can go to the next one. So we listed sort of a Chinese restaurant menu of options, that about a dozen or so that we think policymakers really could chew on here. We did include a bunch that would require state authorization, and we did that with some hesitancy because I think the consensus has been by the county board and county leadership and parks advocates that a state authorized solution is what we need. We need a dedicated funding source that can only be provided by the state. And some argue we need a separate park district, others do not. We still wanted to say, based on what we found elsewhere, as I have said, that these ideas still make sense. The problem is there has been absolutely, we've been talking about this for 25 years, there has been absolutely no willingness by the legislature to grant this dedicated taxation authority, and there isn't much reason to expect that that's going to be forthcoming. What we tried to offer here, as I said, in going through these, are maybe some compromises, maybe some ways of doing this, that if your concern is too high a level of taxation, maybe you can get around them by looking at the fiscal control board model in Minneapolis, or having the dedicated tax set by the voters, or having it shared with municipalities. So we put these out as some options that still could be considered here, but we know that it's very unlikely, unfortunately, that they're going to get a lot of consideration, at least in the near future. So next slide. Our next set of options were options the county could pursue on its own. We think there's real promise in this land and water governance perspective. Let me translate that. We have the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District that does a wonderful job at environmental protection and preserving wetlands and doing flood control, that is already making investments in partnership with the county into county parks, where, yes, we're going to set aside this part of the county park to be a basin to collect water during heavy rains, but in return, county, for your allowing us to do that, we're going to invest in some parks improvements in other parts of the park. Looking at an expanded partnership between MMSD and the county, we think has some promise. I presented this report to the commission at MMSD. Both the commissioners and the executive director, Kevin Schaefer, are very enthusiastic about exploring this idea. We don't know precisely what it would look like, but exploring it. New partnerships with the schools. I already talked about the Madison model. This enterprise fund approach, are we at the point where we have to say that here in Milwaukee County, those revenue generating amenities collectively should pay for themselves so that we can preserve greater property tax levy for everything else? Carving out the regional attractions, I talked about that with the Minneapolis model, and perhaps just having a larger role for municipalities in general. We do have in Kawiki Park an example where the city of Greenfield just finally said, look, county, we feel for you, but you're just not able to take care of the park in our community the way we think it needs to be taken care of. We know it's your park, but we have the ability to do some maintenance. Will you let us do it? And they reach an agreement. These tend to get very political, but we may be at the point where we have to consider more of those. Next one. Finally, there were a set of options that really aren't going to solve the fiscal problem, but things that we thought might help in terms of governance, having a new citizen advisory commission, exploring new relationships with nonprofits, and potentially having them take part in some of the fundraising to support programming that they would potentially do within the parks. Greater use of volunteers. We have great friends groups, but they're mostly raising money, using volunteers to actually do recreation in the parks. And I haven't talked about expanding racial equity strategies just because of time, but we do talk a lot about that in the report. And we learned for some other places where they are doing more to ensure greater attention. And not that the county isn't paying close attention to this, because they are, but some other things that could be done. Finally, last slide, just keep on clicking, get all the bullets on. Yep. Oops. Go back one. There we go. This report came out last October. I presented it, as I said, to the commission, to the county board, all over the place. People thought about it. There was a public session this past summer where the public was able to weigh in. Actually, this coming Tuesday, there is a stakeholders meeting. And the goal is, right now, what we have thrown out there is largely conceptual. The hope is that county leaders with public input and input from stakeholders will say, you know what, there's 3 or 4 of these that we think we ought to be pursuing in more detail. hope is that coming out of this meeting on Tuesday, that will happen, and then we would be charged with really putting pen to paper again and fleshing out some of the details of how some of these options might really work, and seeing if we can at least move forward on some of them. So that's all I have. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. We'll take a few questions here. The service will start at 11. So those of you who need to move on to that will be welcome to do that. Next week, Sherry Briscoe is hosting the third of our series on the parks, and we'll have representatives from the park people and the relatively new Milwaukee County Parks Foundation with the title, Can Citizens Save Our Parks? We'll talk about that aspect of things that Rob mentioned with more citizens groups and volunteers. So we welcome you to join us next week. And for now, I saw a few hands. We'll take some questions. We have two back here. Let's start with Barbara first, and then Elizabeth.
Mine is quick. You mentioned that this is all on your website.
Yes.
So the policy forum website.
It's wispolicyforum.org.
Thank you.
Yep.
Elizabeth?
I just wanted to say that it was a terrible disappointment that part of like Washington Park swimming pool, right in the center of, talk about racial equity, that pool was not available. And a lot of the kids from there went to the park west of us that has, slides and everything else, that our people did not have access to them. Very easily because it's expensive and it's far away from them. Now people in poverty situations don't have cars that they can use. I have to walk to Tulsa. I just wanted to register that, and I am really hopeful that any decisions you make take into account the great poverty and the great need, particularly for recreation and environmental ambience for our poor people.
My response is, I think it's a great point, and it really embodies the conundrum that I laid out, where, though I will say, I mean, this was part of a workforce challenge as well. The county just could not recruit enough lifeguards and other things, but it's also dollars and cents. And yes, the water parks are making some money, and so the water parks need to stay open, and arguably people vote with their feet, but at the same time, no. I mean, these parks are, for low-income kids in the Washington Park area, how critical is this form of recreation? And so, yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
It cools people off in the hot weather.
Yes, precisely.
There are no trees where they live, so they can't find shade.
At the same time, understand the Wisconsin Policy Forum does not make decisions about management of the parks.
Correct. Thank you.
Those are decisions that are made by the Parks District and other entities. So can you describe a little bit more the meeting on Tuesday and what that is, and if that's open to those of us who are interested in these matters?
It's not, and nobody's hiding anything. It's just a group. The Parks Department formed this group when we launched the study that produced this report. It's about 35 people. It includes the county board chairperson. It includes somebody from the county comptroller. It includes I'm calling Shelton, Representative Wasserman, Supervisor Wasserman. So there's county representation. There are the parks people is on that group. The MMSD has a representative on that group. There are various, I'm blanking on the name of the organization that is all about providing for playground and other recreational opportunities for folks with physical disabilities. They're represented on that group. So it's a really nice, diverse group of stakeholders that they want to get together. They had general public input at this meeting in August, and now this is just a little bit more granular discussion with a smaller group of stakeholders. But my guess is whatever comes out of this will again go to the public, or at least to the county board committee, where the public can testify as to, hey, we've decided that, these are the 3 or 4 options that we're going to pursue.
Mm-hmm.
Is this available to the public in any way?
The Tuesday meeting?
The Tuesday meeting isn't, but the results of it will certainly be.
Okay. Any other comments, thoughts? Sherry, do you have any thoughts or comments as we're looking forward to our meeting next week with the park people and the foundation?
No, except that the park people and the Milwaukee Foundation. They will give you some hope and give you some ideas of things we can go in terms of non-public entities. So I think it's worth coming to. But the other thing I wanted to ask you on this parking meter thing. Do these other parks that you studied, do they all have parking meters?
Sherry, we didn't go into that much detail, so I can't tell you that. And again, I didn't want to suggest that, oh yeah, parking meters is the answer. And there's all sorts of issues with parking meters from an equity standpoint, et cetera. I was just using this example that whatever we throw out, and nobody wants to throw out ideas for generating new revenues, obviously. But again, if the choice is, look, the state won't help and the county can't afford to give us more money, so we have to do something. And if the choice is between some creative new revenue streams versus continued deterioration, we have to think about it. And that one got very political very quickly. So I don't know the answer.
Okay, I was just curious
Yep.
because you did talk quite a bit about these revenue generating options. And as you say, when you're desperate to do it, the good side of that is, yeah, it's bringing more money into the parks, and I actually do support those things.
Yep.
The downside is that it gives the state another reason to say, well, why do we need taxes? These counties are creating, generating money. And I think it all goes back to this situation of that our parks are a societal need. And so how do we get them recognized as that? So that they're also part of, if you will, mandated programs by the state. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, you talked about the state funding and for mandated projects, but one of the challenges for Milwaukee County is, and most counties, as you know, as a former county supervisor, is that the state mandates these things, but they underfund them. And so that's part of the rub. How can we move the state to fund what is mandated properly so we have money for our.
Yep, and we've been talking about that problem for, I've lived in Milwaukee since 1994. I know we've been talking about it since then.
Yeah.
And I'm sure several of you are aware that there is a proposal out there to give the county a 1 cent sales tax. And again, I could go on all day about the pros and cons of that, but
Yeah.
the idea of revenue diversification makes a lot of sense to us.
Yeah.
And again, it's right. What should be provided for free and be our shared responsibility? I don't have to preach to all of you on Sunday morning. Versus, you know, what? Yeah, if you can afford it, you can use it. And I think most of us would argue that these parks ought to have pretty open public access.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it, and I hope to see you next week for our forum.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rob.